Chapter 6. Kristin was to set out on her walk to Nidaros 3 days after the Mass of the Selgi men. Later on in the month the city would be full of bustle and commotion, making ready for the Olaf's Mass festival, and earlier the bishop would not be in the town. The evening before, Master Gunnulf had come to Huseby, and early in the morning he went with Sira Eilif to the church to sing matins. The grass was like a grey fur coverlid with the heavy dew, as Kristin walked to the church. But the sunlight was golden on the woods that topped the ridge, and the cuckoo called from the hillside. It looked as though she would have fair weather for her pilgrimage. There was none in the church save Erland and his wife, and the 2 priests in the lighted choir. Erland looked across at Kristin's naked feet. Ice cold must it be for her, standing on the stone floor. She was to walk the 20 miles with no other company than their prayers. He strove to lift up his heart to God, as he had not striven for many a year. She was clad in an ashen grey kirtle, and had a rope about her waist. Underneath, he knew, she wore a shift of sackcloth. A tightly bound wadmal cloth hid her hair. When they stepped from the church out into the morning sunshine, a maid met them with the child. Kristin set herself down on some logs of wood. With her back to her husband, she sat and let the boy suck his fill, that he might be full fed when she set out. Erland stood unmoving, a little space away from her. He was white and cold in the face with the strain. The priests came out a little later. They had taken off their vestments in the sacristy. They stopped by Kristin. Then Sira Eilif went on down towards the manor, but Gunnulf stayed and helped her to get the child securely bound on her back. In a bag that hung from her neck she had the golden garland, money, and a little bread and salt. She took her staff in her hand, bowed deeply before the priest, and began to walk quietly northwards up the path that led to the woods. Erland was left standing, deadly white of face. Of a sudden he began to run. North of the church were some small hillocks covered with scanty grass and close-cropped juniper and birch. Goats were used to graze there. Erland ran up to them. From there he could see her yet a little way on, till she was swallowed up by the woods. Gunnulf walked slowly up after his brother. The priest looked tall and dark in the bright morning light. He too was very pale. Erland stood with mouth half open, the tears running down over his white cheeks. Of a sudden he fell on his knees, then threw himself forward headlong on the short grass and lay sobbing, and tearing at the heather with his long brown fingers. Gunnulf stood motionless. He looked down at the weeping man, then out towards the woods where the woman had vanished. Erland lifted his head a little. "Gunnulf, did you have to lay this upon her? Was it necessary?" he asked again. "Could not you have absolved her?" The other made no answer, and he went on again. "Had I not confessed and done penance?" He sat up. "I bought her 30 days' masses and vigils, and a yearly mass on her death day for ever, and a grave in hallowed ground. I confessed the sin to Bishop Helg, and made pilgrimage to the holy-blooded Schwerin. Could not all this help a little for Kristin?" "If you have done this," said the priest quietly, "laid before God a contrite heart and won his full forgiveness, You sure must know that the marks left by your sin here on earth you must yet strive year in, year out to wipe away. What you brought on her that is now your wife, when you first dragged her down into unclean living and after into manslaughter, that you cannot amend for her, but only God. Pray that he may hold his hand over her on this journey, where you cannot bear her company and guard her. And forget not, brother, so long as you two live, that you saw your wife go forth from your house in this wise, by reason of your sins, more than of her own. Erland said in a little, I had sworn by God and my Christian faith, before I took her honour, that I would never have another to wife. And she promised that never would she have another to husband so long as we lived on earth. You have said yourself, Gunnulf, that they that vow that way are bound in wedlock before God. Any of them who thereafter wedded another would be living in adultery in his eyes. But if so it be, then was it not unclean living, I think, for Kristin to be mine? The sin was not in that you lived with her, said the priest in a while, had that been possible without your transgressing other laws. But you had led this child away into sinful revolt against all whom God had set over her, and at last you brought blood guiltiness upon her. I told you this also that time when we spoke of the matter. Therefore hath the Church ordained laws concerning marriage, that banns be published forth to the world, and we priests shall not wed man and maid against the will of the kindred. He sat down, clasped one knee with his hands, and gazed out over the countryside bright with summer, with the little lake gleaming blue in the valley bottom. You must have known it yourself, Erland. A thicket of briars and thorns and nettles had you sowed around you. How could you draw a young maid into your side, and she not be torn and wounded and bleeding? You stood my friend more than once, brother, in the days when it was Eline and I, said Erland low. I have ever been thankful for it. I scarce deemed that I had done it, said Gunnulf in a voice that shook. Could I have believed of you that you had the heart to deal as you have with a fine and pure young maid, a child in years beside you? Erland made no answer. Gunnulf asked in a low voice, That time in Oslo, did you ever think how it would have gone with Kristin if she had been found with child, while dwelling in a cloister of nuns, and was betrothed of another, her father a proud man, jealous of his honour, all her kindred high-born folk, unused to suffer shame? You may well believe I thought of it. Erland had turned his head aside. I had Munan's word to stand by her. I told her, too, of this. Munan? How could you find in your heart to talk to a man like Munan of Kristin's honour? He is not what you think of him, said Erland shortly. And what about his wife, our kinswoman, Lady Catherine? For 'twas not your meaning, I think, that he should carry Kristin to one of those other places of his where he keeps his paramours. Erland smote the ground with his fist till the knuckles grew bloody. 'Tis the devil's own business for a man when his wife confesses to his brother. She hath not confessed to me, said the priest, and I am not her parish priest. She made her moan to me in her bitter agony and fear, and I strove to help her and to give her such counsel and such comfort as seemed best. Well, Erland threw back his head and looked at his brother. I know it myself. I should not have done it, have had her to come with me to Brynhild's house. The priest sat speechless a moment. Brynhild Flugers? Yeah, didn't she tell you that, when she told the rest? 'Twould be hard enough, I think, for Kristin to tell such things of her own husband in confession, said the priest in a while. And I think she would rather die than tell them in any other place. He sat a while and then said with harsh vehemency, "If it were so, Erland, that you thought you were her husband before God, he that should protect and guard her, then what you have done seems worse to me. You tempted her astray in groves and haylofts. You led her over a harlot's threshold, and last of all you brought her to Bjorn Gunnarsson and Lady Ashild." "You shall not speak that way of Master Ashild," said Erland softly. "You have said yourself before now you believed her guilty of our uncle's death, she and this man, Bjorn." "I don't care about that," said Erland vehemently. "Master Ashild is dear to me." I understood as much," said the priest. His mouth twisted into a little crooked, scornful smile. "Since you grudged it not to her that she should meet Lavrans Bjorgulfsson after you had borne away his daughter. 'Twould seem indeed, Erland, that you deem your friendship can scarce be bought too dear." Jesus! Erland hid his face in his hands, but the priest went on. "Had you seen your wife's anguish of soul, as she shuddered with the horror of her sins, unshriven and helpless? And as she sat there and was to bear your child, and death stood at her door, so young a child herself, and so unhappy? I know, Erland trembled. I know she lay thinking of it in her torment. For Christ's sake, Gunnulf, be quiet now. I am your brother after all." But the priest went on without mercy. "Had I been a man like you, and not a priest, and had I led so young and good a maid astray, I would have freed me from the other woman. God help me, rather I would have done as Master Ashild did with her husband, and burned in hell for it, world without end, than I would have borne that Kristin should suffer such things as you have brought down on the head of your innocent love." Erland sat a while, trembling. "You call yourself a priest," he said in a low voice. "Are you so good a priest that you have never sinned with a woman?" Gunnulf didn't look at his brother. A wave of red flooded his face. "You have no right to ask such things. But yet I will answer you. He who died for us upon the cross knows what bitter need I have of his mercy. But I say to you, Erland, had he on all the earth round not one single servant that was pure and unstained by sin, and were there not in his holy church one single priest more faithful and worthy than I, wretched traitor to my Lord that I am, yet is it the Lord's laws and commandments that are taught in it. Never can his word be polluted by the mouth of an unclean priest. It will but burn and consume our lips. But this, maybe, you cannot understand. But this you know as well as I, and every other filthy thrall of Satan whom he hath bought with his blood. God's law cannot be shaken, nor his honour diminished. As surely as his sun is alike mighty, whether it shine upon the barren sea and waste grey mountain, or upon these fair and fertile lands." Erland had hidden his face in his hands. He sat long silent, and when he spoke, his voice was dry and hard. "Priest or no priest, since you are not so absolute in saintly living, understand you not? Could you do to a woman who had slept in your arms, borne you 2 children, could you do to her as Ashild did to her husband?" The priest was silent a little. Then he said a little mockingly, "You were not wont to judge Master Ashild so hardly. It cannot be the same for a man, I think, as for a woman. I remember the last time they were here at Huseby, and Sir Bjorn was with them. We were sitting by the hearth, mother and Ashild, and Sir Bjorn was playing his harp and singing to them. I was standing by his knee. Then Bard called her. He was in bed, and he would have her go to rest at once. He used words so shameless and immodest. Master Arsil rose, and Sir Bjorn too. He left the hall, but first they looked at each other. Afterwards I thought, when I grew old enough to understand, it may well be it is true. I had begged leave to light Sir Bjorn across to the house he was to sleep in, but I dared not, and I dared not lie in the hall. I ran out and laid down by the men in the servants' house. By Jesus, Gunnulf, for a man it can never be as it was for Arsil that night. No, Gunnulf. Kill a woman that, except I took her with another. Yet had he done that very thing. But this Gunnulf could not say to his brother. So he asked coldly, was it not true then either that Eileen had been untrue to you? Untrue? Erland turned on his brother, suddenly afire. Mean you that I should have laid it to her charge, that she had given herself to Gisa, after I had made plain to her again and yet again that betwixt us all must be at an end? Gunnulf bowed his head. No, like enough you are right, he said wearily in a low voice. But under this little breath of approval, Erland flamed up. He threw back his head and looked at the priest. You are so tender of Kristin, Gunnulf. Strange how you have hung over her all the spring, almost more than is seemly for a brother and a priest. Almost it might seem you grudged her to me. Were it not that things were with her as they were when you first saw her, folks might think... Gunnulf looked at him. Beside himself, under his brother's look, Erland sprang up, and Gunnulf rose too. He did not withdraw his look, and Erland struck out at him with his clenched fist. The priest caught and gripped his wrist. Erland tried to close with his brother, but Gunnulf stood immovable, holding him off. Erland grew quiet straight away. I should have remembered you were a priest, he said low. You see that on that score you have no need to repent, said Gunnulf with a little smile. Erland stood chafing his wrist. You always did have the devil's own strength in your hands. This is like the days when we were boys. Gunnulf's voice had grown strangely soft and mild. I have thought of it often all these years I have been from home, the time when we were boys. Often we were unfriends then, but never did it last long, Erland. But now, Gunnulf, said the other sorrowfully, it can never more be as when we were boys. No, said the priest quietly, 'tis like it cannot. They stood a long time. At last Gunnulf said, I leave you now, Erland. I will go now down to Eilif and bid him farewell, and then I shall set out. I am going to the priest in Orkadal. I shall not come to Nidaros while Kristin is there. He smiled a little. Gunnulf, I didn't mean it that way. Don't go from me like this. Gunnulf stood still. He drew 1 or 2 deep breaths, then said, One thing I would have you know of me, Erland, since you know that I have knowledge of all this concerning you. Sit down. Priest sat himself down as before. Erland stretched himself on the ground before him, and hand under chin looked up into his brother's strangely stiff and strained face. Then he smiled a little. What is it, Gunnulf? Would you make confession to me? Aye, said his brother softly. Yet then he sat a long time silent. Erland saw his lips move once, and he clenched his folded hands tightly round his knee. What is it? A smile flickered over Erland's face. Sure it cannot be that some fair lady, far off in southern lands... No, said the priest. His voice grew rough and hoarse. 'Tis not of love. Do you know, Erland, how it came about that I was vowed to be a priest?" "Yes, when our brothers died, and they feared they would lose us too." "No," said Gunnulf. "Munin, they thought, was well again, and gout had not taken the sickness. 'Twas not till the winter after that he died. But you were lying, choking to death, and mother vowed me to the service of St. Olaf if he would save your life." "Who told you this?" asked Erland in a while. "Ingrid, my foster mother." "It's true indeed that I have been a strange gift to give St. Olaf," said Erland, laughing a little. "He had sure been ill-served with me." "But you have said yourself, Gunnulf, you were well content you had been called to the priesthood from childhood up." "Yes," said the priest, "but 'twas not always so. I remember the day you rode from Huseby with Munin Bardson to go to the king, our kinsman, and become his man. Your horse danced under you, your new arms glittered and shone. I was never to bear arms. Fair you were, my brother. You were but 16 winters old, and already I had seen for many a day past that you were well loved of dames and damsels." "That glory didn't last long," said Erland. "I learned to cut my nails straight across, swear by Jesus at every second word, and use my dagger to ward with while I struck with my sword. Then was I sent north and met her, and was hunted from the bodyguard with shame, and my father shut his doors against me." "And you fled forth from the land with a fair lady," said Gunnulf, quietly as before, "and we heard at home that you were captain of St. Jacob's Castle." "Aye, that was no such great matter as it sounded here at home," said Erland, laughing. "Father and you were not friends. Me he didn't think enough of to care to be unfriends with me. Mother held me dear, I know. But how little she deemed me worth weighed against you, that marked I best when you had fled from the land. You, brother, were the only one that loved me truly, and God knows that you were my dearest friend on earth. But in those days when I was young and witless, times have been when I deemed you had been given all too much more than I. This it was that I wanted to tell you, Erland." Erland lay face downwards on the hillside. "Don't go, Gunnulf," he begged. "Yes," said the priest, "I go. Too much have we said now, one to the other. God and Mary Virgin grant that we may meet again in a better hour. Farewell, Erland." "Farewell," said Erland, not looking up. When Gunnulf, some hours later, came forth from the priest's house, ready for his journey, he saw a man riding over the hills towards the southern woods. He had a bow slung across his back, and three hounds ran by his horse's side. It was Erland. Meanwhile, Kristin was walking swiftly on her way, by the forest path that led over the hills. The sun stood high in the heavens now, and the pine tops shone against the summer sky. But within the woods was still the cool and freshness of morning. The air was full of the balmy scent of pine needles and peaty soil, and of the twin flower that sprinkled all the knolls with its small pink bells, and the grassy pathway was damp and soft and comforting to her feet. Kristin walked, saying over her prayers, and now and then she looked up at the little white fair-weather clouds that swam in the blue above the treetops. All the time the only thing she could think of was brother Edvin. So had he walked and walked, year in, year out, from early spring to deepest winter, over the mountain paths, under black scars and white snowfields. He had rested at the satyrs, drunk of the beck and eaten of the bread that satyr girls and horse-herds bore out to him. Then had he bidden farewell and called down God's peace and benison on fold and castle. down through the sighing woods of the hillsides he had passed, down into the dale. Tall and stoop-shouldered, with head bent forward, he had wandered along the high road past the well-tilled farms and the dwelling places, and everywhere, wheresoever he passed, his loving intercessions for all men left, as it were, fair weather in his track. She met not a living thing, save now and then a few cattle. There were satyrs on these hilltops. But the path was well trodden, and over the marshy grounds were cordwood bridgeways. Kristin was unafraid. She felt as though the monk walked invisibly by her side. "Brother Edvin, if in truth thou art a holy saint, if thou standest before the face of God, pray for me now. Lord Jesus Christ, Holy Mary, Saint Olaf." She longed to reach the goal of her pilgrimage. She longed to cast from her the burden of the hidden sins of years, the weights of masses and offices that she had filched unlawfully, while yet unshriven and unrepentant. She longed to be free and cleansed, even more keenly than she had yearned to be delivered of her burden in the spring before the boy was born. He slept so soundly and securely on his mother's back. He waked not till she had passed through the woods and come down to the Snowbird Farms, and could look out over Budvik and the Saltness arm of the fjord. She sat down in a pasture off the path, slung the bundle with the babe in it round into her lap, and opened the breast of her kirtle. It was sweet to feel him against her breast, sweet to be able to sit a while, a blessed sweetness through all her body to feel the stone-hard milk-swollen breasts grow soft as he sucked. The countryside lay still below her, baking in the sunshine, with green meadows and bright cornfields amid dark woods. Here and there a little smoke went up above the house roofs. In some places the hay harvest had begun. She had leave to cross from Saltness Sand over to Stein by boat. Once across, she had come to a quite unknown country. The road she must follow across the bines led up for a while among farms. Then she came into woods again. But here she never had to go for long out of sight of human dwellings. She was very tired. But she thought of her parents. Had they not walked barefoot all the way from Jorengard in Sill, over Dovre and down to Nidaros, bearing Ulfhild between them on a litter? She must not think how heavy Narkvi was upon her back. Worse was the dreadful itching in her head from the thick, sweat-drenched wadmal hood, and round her waist, where the rope pressed her garments against her body, her shift had gnawed at the flesh till there must be raw places on it. Other wayfarers began to pass her on the road. Now and again folk would ride by, going one way or the other. She overtook a peasant cart bound for the city with wares. The heavy, solid wheels bumped and jolted over roots and stones, creaking and squeaking. 2 men were dragging along a beast for the slaughterhouse. They looked a little at the young pilgrim woman for her comeliness' sake, but such wayfarers were a common sight in this countryside. At one place some men were busy putting up a house a little off the road. They called out to her, and an oldish man came running up and proffered her a drink of ale. Kristin curtsied, drank, and gave thanks in words such as poor folks were wont to say to her when she gave alms. Soon after she had to rest again. She found a little green slope near by the road with a stream running by it. Kristin laid her child in the grass. He wakened and began to shriek piteously, so that she hastened with a wandering mind through the prayers she needed to say. Then she took Narkvi in her lap and unwound his swaddling clothes. He had fouled his cloths, and she had but little with her to put in their stead. So she washed out the cloths and laid them on a warm, smooth rock to dry in the sun. The outer clothes she wrapped loosely around the boy. He liked this well, for he could kick and sprawl now as he drank from his mother's breast. Kristin looked with joy at his fine, rosy white limbs and pressed down one of his hands between her breasts as she suckled him. 2 horsemen rode by at a sharp trot. Kristin glanced up. It was a master and his man. But suddenly the master reined up his horse, sprang from the saddle and came back on foot to where she sat. It was Simon Anderson. "Maybe you preferred I should not greet you?" he asked. He stood holding his horse and looking down at her. He was clad as for a journey, in a sleeveless leather jerkin over a light blue linen coat. A silk cap was on his head, and his face was red and shone with sweat. "'Tis strange to see you, but perhaps you have no mind to talk with me." "Surely you must know. How is it with you, Simon?" Kristin drew up her bare feet under her skirt and tried to take the child away from her breast. But the boy screamed and gulped and groped about so that she was forced to lay him to it again. She gathered her kirtle over the breast as best she could and sat with eyes downcast. "Is it yours?" asked Simon, pointing to the child. "Nay, what a foolish question," he said, laughing. "'Tis a son, I warrant. Erland Nicolausen has fortune with him." He had bound his horse to a tree, and now he sat down on a stone a little away from Kristin. He brought his sword forward between his knees and sat with his hands on the hilt, turning up the earth with the scabbard end. "I look not to meet you here north of Dover, Simon," said Kristin, that she might say something. "No," said Simon. "I have had no errands in this part of the land before." Kristin called to mind that she had heard somewhat, at her homecoming feast, of the youngest son of Arne Jvalsen of Ranheim being to wed Andresdar's youngest daughter. "Had he been at Ranheim?" she asked. "You know of it?" said Simon. "Yes, it has got about already in this countryside, I can well believe." "It is so then," said Kristin, "that Jevald is to wed Sigrid?" Simon looked up sharply, pressing his lips together. "I have not set foot outside Huseby courtyard all the winter," said Kristin, "and few folks have I seen. I heard there was talk of this wedding." "Aye, as well that you hear it from me, I think. It must needs get abroad up here." He sat silent a while. "Jevald died 3 days before winter night. He fell with his horse and broke his back. Do you remember, just before you come into Differen, where the road runs east of the river and the ground falls sheer? Oh, no, perhaps you don't remember. We were on our way to their betrothal ale. Arne and his sons had come by sea to Oslo." Simon stopped short. Maybe she loved Jevald, Sigrid, and had been joyful that she was to wed him?" asked Kristin, shyly and fearfully. "Yes," said Simon. "And she bore a son to him at Apostles' Mass last spring." "Oh, Simon!" Sigrid Undset, with the brown curls about her little round face. When she laughed there came deep pits in her cheeks. Dimples and little childish white teeth. Simon had these too. Kristin remembered that when she was in her less gentle moods towards her betrothed, this had seemed to her unmanly. Most of all after she had come to know Erland. They were much alike, Sigrid and Simon, but that she was so plump and laughing made her but the fairer. She was 14 winters old then. Such joyful laughter as Sigrid's Kristin had never heard. Simon was always teasing and jesting with his younger sister. Kristin had felt that he held her dearest of them all. "You know that father was fondest of Sigrid," said Simon. "So he was fain that she and Jevald should see if they could like one another before he clinched the bargain with Arne." And they did. Perhaps a little more than seemed good. They were forever flinging at each other when they met, and glancing and laughing. This was last summer at Differen. But they were so young, none could have thought of this. And Astrid, you know she was betrothed when you and I, she said nothing against it. And Torgrim, you know, has great wealth and is kind too, after a fashion. But nothing nor no one can please him, and he always thinks he has all the hurts and ailments that folks ever heard tell of. So we were glad, all of us, that Sigrid was so joyful in the match that had been made for her. And when we brought Javald home like this, Halfrid, my wife, managed things so that she went home with us to Manvik. And then afterward it came to light that Javald had not left her alone. They were silent a while. Then Kristin said softly, "This has been no joyous journey for you then, Simon." "Oh, no." Then he laughed a little. "But soon I shall be used now to riding on woeful errands, Kristin. And for this one, you see, I was the best. Father has not the strength, and Sigrid stays with me at Manvik with the boy. Now have we ordered things so that he will take his father's place among the Ranheim kindred, and I could see on them, I think, that he will not be unwelcome, the poor little boy, when he is presently sent thither." "And your sister?" asked Kristin, catching her breath. "Where will she be?" "Father will have her home to Differen now," he said in a low voice. "Simon! Oh, have you the heart to let this be?" "You sure can see," he answered without looking up, "how great a gain it is for the boy to be taken into his father's kindred from the very start. Halfrid and I would gladly have them both with us. No sister could have been more faithful and loving towards another than Halfrid was to Sigrid. None of her kindred have been hard to her. Don't believe that. Not even father, though this thing has broken him utterly. But don't you see? Unrighteous had it been if any of us had set ourselves against that which gives the innocent boy his father's name and heritage." Kristin's babe let go the breast. The mother drew the clothes quickly over her bosom and pressed the little one to her, trembling. He gulped contentedly a couple of times and slobbered over himself and his mother's hands. Simon glanced over at the two and said with a sort of smile, "You had better fortune, Kristin, than befell my sister." "Aye, surely it must seem to you no righteous fate," said Kristin softly, "that I am called wife, and my son is true born. For it would have served me right had I been left with a fatherless bastard." "I would have thought that the worst tidings I could have heard," said Simon. "I wish you nothing but good, Kristin," he said in a lower voice. Soon after he asked her of the road. Northward he had journeyed by ship from Tunsberg, he said. "I must ride on now and see to it that I overtake my man." "Is it Finn that you have with you?" asked Kristin. "No. Finn is wedded now. He is with me no longer. Do you remember him still?" asked Simon with a little gladness in his voice. "Is he a fair child, Sigrid's boy?" asked Kristin, looking at Nagby. "I hear them say so. To me one babe in arms looks much like all the others," answered Simon. Then I think you have no children yourself," said Kristin, and could not help smiling. "No," he answered shortly, and thereupon he bade farewell and rode away. When Kristin set out again, she had the child on her back no longer. She bore it in her arms, pressing its face into the hollow of her neck. But she could think of nothing else but Sigrid Undset. But her father could never have done it. Lavrans Bjorgulfsson ride out to beg for his daughter's base-born child, part and lot with his father's kindred? Never could he have done it. And never would he have had the heart to take her babe from her, tear a little being out of his mother's arms, tear him from her breast, with her milk still on his innocent lips. My Nakvi, no, he would never have had the heart. If 'twas righteous 10 times over, my father would never have done it. But she could not drive a picture from her mind.
A troop of riders vanishing northward through the gorge, where the dale grows narrow and the mountains crowd together, black with pine woods. Cold gusts come from the river that rushes thundering over the great rocks, ice green, foaming, with here and there black pools. He that should fall over there would be hurled from rock to rock and crushed straightway. Jesus Maria! Then she saw the fields at home at Yorengard of a clear summer night. She saw herself running down the path to the little green clearing in the alder brake by the river, where they were used to wash clothes. The river ran with a changeless harsh roar among the great stones of its shelving bed. Lord Christ, I can do nothing else. Oh, but Father had never had the heart to do it. Not if it were never so right. When I prayed on my bended knees, Father, you must not take my child from me. Kristin stood on Figgensbrecker and saw the city lying below her in the golden sunlight. Beyond the river's broad, shining curves lay brown houses with green turfed roofs, dark domes of leaves in the gardens, light-hued stone houses with pointed gables, churches that heaved up black shingled backs, and churches with dully gleaming leaden roofs. But above the green land, above the fair city, rose Christ's church, so mighty, so gloriously shining, 'twas as though all things else lay prostrate at its feet. With the evening sun blazing full upon its breast, and on the shining glass of its windows, with towers and giddy spires and golden vanes, it stood pointing up into the bright summer heavens. Around lay a countryside green with summer, bearing worshipful great manors on its slopes. Outside again the fjord stretched wide and bright, with shadows drifting upon it from the great summer clouds that rose over the shining blue hills beyond. The cloister holm, low among plashing wavelets, lay like a green garland, white-flowered with its stone houses. So many ships' masts out in the roadstead, so many fairest houses. Quite overcome, sobbing, the young woman flung herself down before the cross by the wayside, where thousands of pilgrims had lain before her, thanking God for those helping hands stretched out toward human souls on their journey through this fair and perilous world. The bells were ringing to vespers in churches and cloisters when Kristin came into Christ's churchyard. She dared to glance for a moment up at the church's west front. Then, blinded, she cast down her eyes. Human beings had never compassed this work of their own strength. God's Spirit had worked in the holy Oystein and the builders of this house that came after him. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Now she understood the words. A reflection of the glory of God's kingdom witnessed in these stones that his will was all that was fair. Kristin trembled. Aye, well might God turn in wrath from all that was foul, from sin and shame and uncleanness. In the galleries of the heavenly dwelling stood holy men and women, so fair that she dared not look upon them. Lovely unwithering tendrils of eternity wound silently upwards, broke into leaf on tower and spire, and blossomed in stone monstrances. Over the midmost door hung Christ upon his cross. Mary and John the Evangelist stood by his side, and they were white as though fashioned out of snow, and gold glinted on the white. 3 times she walked around the church praying. The mighty wall masses with bewildering riches of pillars and arches and windows, the glimpses of the huge slopes of the roof, the tower, the gold of the spire far up in skyey spaces. Kristin sank under her load of sin. She trembled when she kissed the hewn stone of the portal. In a lightning flash, she saw the dark carven wood round the church door at home that she had kissed with childish lips after her father and mother. She sprinkled holy water over the child and herself, and thought of the time her father used to do this when she was small. With the child pressed tight in her arms, she went forward up the church. She went as though through a forest. The columns were furrowed like ancient trees, and in through the forest flowed the light, many-hued and clear as song, from the pictured windows. High up above her, beasts and men sported among the stone leafage, and angels played. And yet far, dizzily far higher, the vaulting soared, lifting the church towards God. In a hall that lay to one side, worship was being held at an altar. Kristin sank down on her knees by a pillar. The singing cut into her like a too strong light. Now she saw how low she lay in the dust. Pater noster, credo in unum Deum, Ave Maria, gratia plena. She had learnt her prayers by saying them after her father and mother before she understood a word, longer since than she could remember. Lord Jesus Christ, was there ever a woman so sinful as she? High under the triumphal arch, uplifted over the people, hung Christ the crucified. The stainless virgin that was his mother stood gazing in deathly anguish up at her innocent son, suffering a death of torment like an evildoer. And here knelt she with the fruit of sin in her arms. She pressed the child to her. He was as fresh as an apple, red and white as a rose. He was awake now and lay looking up at her with his clear, sweet eyes. Conceived in sin, born under her hard, evil heart, drawn from her sin-polluted body, so fair, so whole, so unspeakably lovely and fresh and pure. The undeserved mercy broke her heart asunder. She knelt, crushed with penitence, and the weeping welled up out of her soul as blood flows from a death wound. Knock me, child of mine. God visiteth the sins of the fathers upon the children. Didn't I know that? Ah, yes, I knew it. But I had no mercy in my heart for the innocent life that might be awakened in my womb, to be accursed and condemned to torment for my sin. Did I repent my sin when I bore you within me, my beloved, beloved son? No, 'twas not repentance. My heart was hard with anger and evil thoughts in the hour when I first felt thee move, so little and so defenceless. Magnificat anima mea Dominum, et exaltavit spiritus meus in Deus salutari meo. Thus she sang, the gentle queen of all women, when she was chosen out to bear him that was to die for our sins. I called not to mind him that had power to take away the burden of my sin and my child's sin. No, 'twas not repentance. I but feigned me lowly and wretched, and begged that the commands of righteousness be broken, for that I could not bear it if God upheld his law and chastened me, according to the word that I had known all my days. Ah, now she knew it. She had thought that God was such a one as her own father, that St. Olaf was as her father. She had thought all the time, deep in her heart, that when her punishment grew to be heavier than she could bear, then she would meet, not with justice, but with compassion. She was weeping so that she could not rise when the people stood up during the worship. She lay on, crouched in a heap over her child. Near her there were other folk that did not rise, 2 well-dressed peasant women with a young boy between them. She looked up towards the choir. Behind the golden grated doors St. Olaf's shrine gleamed in the darkness, towering high behind the altar. An icy cold shuddering ran through her. There lay his holy body, awaiting the day of resurrection. Then would the lid fly open, and he would arise. With his axe in hand, he would stride down this mighty church, and up from the paven floor, up from the earth outside, up from every graveyard in Norway's land, would the dead, yellow skeletons arise. They would be clothed upon with flesh, and would muster themselves round their king. They that had striven to tread in his blood-marked footsteps, and they that had only sought him, that he might help them with the burdens of sin and sorrow and sickness that here in life they had bound on themselves and their children. Now they throng around their Lord and pray him to lay their needs before God. Lord, hearken to my prayer for this folk, which I held so dear that I would rather suffer outlawry and need and hatred and death than that man or maid should grow up in Norway and not know that thou diedst to save all sinners. Lord, thou who didst bid us to go out and make all peoples thy disciples, with my blood did I, Olaf Haraldsson, write thy evangel in the Norse tongue for these my poor freedmen. Kristin shut her eyes, sick and dizzy. The king's countenance was before her. His flaming eyes saw to the bottom of her soul. She trembled under St. Olaf's glance. Do you understand now, Kristin, that you need help?
Aye, Lord, now I understand it. Sore need is mine, that thou support me, that I may not turn from God again. Be with me, thou chief of his people, when I bear forth my prayers, and pray thou shalt I be granted mercy. Holy Olaf, pray for me.
Commundum crea in me, Deus, et spiritum rectum innova in visceribus meis. Libera me de sanguinibus, Deus, Deus, salutis mei. The worship was at an end. Folks were leaving the church. The two peasant women who had knelt near Kristin rose up, but the boy between them did not rise. He began to move over the pavement by pressing the knuckles of his clenched hands on the flags and jerking himself along like a young unfledged crow. He had tiny legs twisted up close under his body. The women walked so as to hide him as well as they could with their garments. When they were out of sight, Kristin threw herself down and kissed the church floor where they had passed by her. Somewhat doubtful and at a loss, she stood by the entrance to the choir when a young priest came out of the grated door. He stopped before the red-eyed young woman, and Kristin told him her errand, as well as she might. At first he scarce understood. She brought out the golden garland and held it towards him. "Oh, are you Kristin Lavransdatter, Erlend's wife of Huseby?" He looked at her with a little wonder. Her face was all swollen with weeping. Aye, your brother-in-law, Master Gunnulf, he spoke of this." He led her out into the sacristy, took the wreath and unwrapped the linen cloth from around it, then looked at it. Then he smiled a little. "Aye, you will understand, I think, that there must be witnesses and such like by. You cannot give away such a precious thing, mistress, as though 'twere a piece of buttered bread. But I can take it in charge meanwhile. 'Tis like you would not choose to bear it about with you in the city. Oh, pray Canon Arne to be so good as to come hither," he said to a church servant. "Your husband should be with you too, I think, rightly. But it may be Gunnulf has some letter from him. You are to be brought before the Archbishop himself, was it not so? Else 'tis Hark Thomason, who is pernitentiarius. I know not whether Gunnulf has talked with Lord Ayleaf. But you must come hither to matins tomorrow, and you can ask for me after lauds. I am called Paul Aslaksson. Him," he pointed to the child, "you must leave in the hostel. You are to sleep in the sisters' hostel at Bark, I think your brother-in-law said. Oh, pray Canon Arne to be so good as to come hither," he said to a church servant. Another priest came in, and the two spoke together a while. The first opened a little locker in the wall, took out a pair of scales, and weighed the wreath, while the other wrote in a book. Then they laid the wreath away in the press and locked it. Canon Paul was about to lead her out, but he asked first if she wished that he should lift her son up to St. Olaf's shrine. He took the boy with the sure, somewhat careless deftness of a priest used to holding babies at baptism. Kristin went with him into the church, and he asked if she, too, would not fain kiss the shrine. "I dare not," thought Kristin, but she followed the priest up the steps to the high platform whereon the shrine was set. There came, as it were, a great blinding white light before her eyes when she approached her lips to the golden tabernacle. The priest looked at her for a moment, fearing she might fall down in a swoon. But she rose again to her feet. Then he let the child's forehead touch the sacred shrine. Canon Paul went with her to the church door and asked if she was sure she could find her way to the ferry. Then he bade her good night. He had spoken all the time in smooth, dry fashion, like any other mannerly young courtier. It had begun to rain a little, and a breathing of sweet scents came from the gardens and from the street, which was fresh and green like a country courtyard, save for the strips worn bare by the coming and going of people and carts. Kristin sheltered the boy from the rain as best she could. He was so heavy now, so heavy that her arms were numb and dead from bearing him, and he whimpered and cried unceasingly. Like enough, he was hungry again. His mother was deadly tired, from the day-long walking and from all the weeping and the vehemency of her emotion in the church. She was cold, and the rain grew heavier. The leaves of the trees glanced and shivered under the spattering drops. She threaded her way through the lanes and came out on an open place, where she could see ahead to where the river ran broad and grey, its surface pitted like a sieve by the falling drops. There was no ferry boat. Kristin spoke to two men who had taken shelter under the floor of a warehouse that stood on piles at the water's edge. They said she must go out to the landing place. The nuns had a house there, and there was a ferryman. Kristin dragged herself up again across the open place, footsore and wet and weary. She came to a little grey stone church. Behind it lay some houses inside a fence. Nakvi was shrieking wildly so that she could not go into the church, but the sound of singing came to her through the unglazed window openings, and she knew the antiphon. Laetare Regina Caeli, rejoice thou, Queen of Heaven, for he whom thou wert chosen to bear is arisen even as he said, Hallelujah. It was the song the Minorites sang after Compline. Brother Edvin had taught her this hymn to the Lord's Mother when she watched by his bed those nights when he lay in mortal sickness at home with them at Jorengard. She stole into the churchyard, and standing by the wall with her child upon her arm, she said it softly over to herself. Nothing, Kristin, nothing that you could do could turn your father's heart from you. 'Tis therefore you must give him no more cause for sorrow. Even as thy nail-pierced hands were outstretched upon the cross, O dear Lord of heaven, howsoever far away a soul had strayed from the straight path, yet were the nail-pierced hands stretched out towards it yearningly. Nothing was necessary save this one thing, that the sinful souls should turn them to those open arms, freely, as a child goes to its father, not like thralls hunted home to their cruel master. Now she understood how hateful sin was. Again there came that pain in her breast, as though her heart would break asunder in penitence and in shame at her unworthiness of the mercy shown her. Close into the church wall there was a little shelter from the rain. She sat down upon a gravestone and began to still the child's hunger. Now and then she bent forward and kissed the little down-covered head. She must have fallen asleep. Someone touched her shoulder. A monk in orders and an old lay brother with a sexton's spade in his hand stood before her. The barefoot friar asked if she sought lodging for the night. It flashed across her. She would much rather abide here tonight with the Minorites, Brother Edvin's brethren. And it was so far to Bach, and she was sinking with weariness. Then the monk bade the lay brother bring this woman to the women's hostel, and give her a little calamus wash for her feet. She is footsore, I see." It was close and dark in the women's hostel. It stood without the fence, out by the lane. The lay brother brought her water to wash with and a little food, and she sat by the hearth and tried to quiet the child. 'Twas plain that Nakvi felt it in his food that his mother was worn out and had fasted that day. He wept and whimpered between times while sucking at her exhausted breasts. Kristin took mouthfuls of the milk the lay brother had brought her. She tried to squirt it from her mouth into the child's, but the little boy clamoured loudly against this new fashion of taking in food, and the old man laughed and shook his head. "She must drink it herself," he said. "Then the boy would soon get the good of it." At last he went away. Kristin crept up into one of the uppermost box beds, close under the roof. From it she could reach up to open a trap in the roof, and there was need, for there was a sickening smell in the hostel. Kristin opened the trap. The rain-washed air of the bright, cool summer night streamed in about her. She sat in the short bed with her head and neck propped against the wall timbers. There were so few pillows in the bed. The boy slept on her lap. She had meant to shut the trap again in a while, but she fell asleep unawares. Far on in the night she awoke. The summer moon shone in, pale and honey-yellow, across the child and her, and lit up the wall over against them. And she was aware of a figure in the midst of the stream of moonlight, hovering between the floor and the roof tree. He was clad in an ashen grey frock. He was tall and stoop-backed. Now he turned his old, furrowed face towards her. It was Brother Edvin. He smiled, and his smile was unspeakably tender, a little roguishly merry, just as when he lived on earth. Kristin didn't wonder at this at all. Humble, happy, full of hope and trust, she looked at him, awaiting that which he might say or do. The monk laughed and held up an old, heavy fur mitten toward her. Then he hung it on the moonbeam and left it hanging there. And then he smiled still more, nodded to her, and melted away.